The envelope slid beneath the rolling door at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November of 2019. And the snow that had been falling for 6 hours covered the courier's footprints before his sedan reached the end of the gravel road. Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $185,000. The check rested on a floor of packed pine boards and curled maple shavings 3 feet from a workbench where a single oil lamp had been left burning low. No one was inside the workshop to see it arrive. The man who would find it the next morning was 12 miles away in a cemetery on the western slope of Mount Holly, kneeling in the snow beside two graves he had not visited in 11 months, asking forgiveness for the years he had spent learning how to wait. His name was Aldous Brennan. In November of 2019, he was 51 years old. Tall, with shoulders rounded by a lifetime of leaning over a workbench, hands the color of weathered oak hair, gone the color of river stone. But this story does not begin in 2019. It begins 17 years earlier in the autumn of 2002 with a young man who had just lost everything that gave his life its shape, and with another man, a stranger in a charcoal overcoat, who walked up to a fence one cold morning and offered him garbage. Before we go any further, if you find peace in stories about quiet men, patient hands, and the strange kindness of a long life lived slowly, take one moment now to subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories every week late into the evening for those of you who understand that some endings cannot be rushed. Subscribe and stay close. The fire is warm tonight, and the snow is just beginning. Now, Ludlow, Vermont. The first week of October 2002. The sugar maples along Jewel Brook Road had turned the color of old copper, and the air smelled of wood smoke and the faint mineral chill that comes of the Black River when the nights drop below freezing. Aldous Brennan stood in the doorway of his grandfather's violin shop, a small cedar-shingled building, set back from the road behind a stand of white birches. He held a coffee cup gone cold in one hand and a folded letter in the other. The letter was addressed to the Human Resources Department of the Bellows Falls paper mill. It was an application for a position as a night shift security guard. $11.40 an hour. Health insurance after 90 days. Behind him, on a long workbench of soft pine worn smooth by 3 generations of elbows, a thin film of dust had begun to settle on his grandfather's tools. Cillian Brennan had carried those tools across the Atlantic from Donegal in 1923 pieces in a leather roll lined with green felt, each one signed inside the handle by the master who had forged it. Aldous had not picked up the smallest of them, a thumb plane the size of a walnut, in 4 months. He had not picked up any of them, because 4 months ago his wife Cora had gone into labor at 28 weeks, and the boy they had named Finan had lived for 19 hours, and Cora had lived for 30 more. And Aldous had come home to a workshop full of unfinished violins whose voices he could no longer hear. So, the letter, the job, the end of 117 years of Brennan luthier in the Green Mountains. He walked down the gravel path toward the mailbox at the end of the drive. 200 feet of crushed stone and frost-killed goldenrod. He opened the mailbox door. He held the envelope above the slot, and then a voice from the porch behind him, soft and confused. Aldous, your father is going to be late for supper if you don't call him in from the barn." He turned. His mother, Matilda Brennan, 72 years old, standing on the porch in her blue cardigan and her good Sunday slippers, her white hair loose around her shoulders, the way she had never worn it in public. She had been having more bad afternoons than good ones since August. His father had been dead since 1991. There was no barn. "I'll get him, Mama. You go back inside. It's cold." She nodded, looking faintly puzzled the way she always looked now, in that first half-second before the fog rolled back in, as though she had walked into a room and could not remember why. She turned and went back through the screen door. He heard it shut behind her, the soft slap of wood against wood that had been the sound of his childhood. He looked at the envelope. He thought about the polyester uniform, the flashlight, the 8 hours of fluorescent light and concrete floors. He thought about Cillian's hands, the way they had moved across the belly of a half-carved violin, the way another man's hands might move across the face of a sleeping child. He thought about Cora, who used to come into the workshop on Sunday afternoons with 2 mugs of tea and sit on the tall stool by the window and say nothing at all, just watch him work. Because she said the sound of a small plane curling spruce was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. He put the envelope back in his coat pocket. He would mail it tomorrow. He did not know yet that by tomorrow morning, he would tear the letter into 4 pieces and drop them into the wood stove because of a stranger in expensive shoes who would walk up to his fence with an offer he believed was generous, and because of his mother, who in a single bright window of memory would lead him to a cedar chest in the back of the workshop and place into his hands a drawing she had hidden from him for 26 years. The stranger arrived the next morning at 9:10. His name was Silas Whitmore. He was 29 years old. He had been hired 4 months earlier as the new director of forest operations for Whitmore Timber and Veneer, the family-owned hardwood company that held cutting rights on 6,000 acres of the Green Mountain National Forest just north of Ludlow. Silas had inherited the title from his father, who had inherited it from his uncle. And Silas had spent the past 4 months trying to prove to a board of directors twice his age that the MBA he had earned at the Wharton School was worth the salary they were paying him. He drove a deep green Range Rover with Massachusetts plates. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat with a velvet collar, the kind of coat a man wears when he wants to be taken seriously in a town where most men wear Carhartt. His hair was the color of wet sand parted carefully on the left. Silas Whitmore was not a cruel man. It is important as we go forward through the next 17 years that you understand this. He was not greedy in the way the villains of old stories are greedy. He did not laugh at suffering. He did not even most of the time recognize it. He was something more common and more dangerous. He was a young man who had been taught by every teacher he had ever respected that the world was a set of inefficiencies waiting to be corrected, and that a man's worth was measured by how many of them he eliminated before lunch. That morning, he had a problem. Whitmore Timber harvested approximately 200 mature sugar maples and red spruce every year from the northern allotment. The straight clear-grained trunks went to flooring mills in Quebec. But the trees that grew on the steep western faces of the mountains, twisted by 150 winters of wind off Lake Champlain, produced lumber that the flooring buyers rejected. The grain was wavy, sometimes spiraled, sometimes shimmered like watered silk under a planer blade. The mills called it figured maple defective, unstable, useless for joists or planks. Whitmore Timber paid a hauling company $300 a load to truck the rejected wood to a cogeneration plant in Rutland, where it was chipped and burned for electricity. Silas had built a 48-slide PowerPoint deck the previous Friday, demonstrating that if he could find a local party willing to take the rejected wood for free, the company would eliminate $27,000 a year in disposal fees. He had been driving the back roads of 3 counties for 10 days, looking for a farmer with a wood stove and a long fence line. That morning, he turned onto Jewel Brook Road, saw the cedar-shingled workshop and the long split-rail fence behind it, and a man bent over a vegetable garden, pulling the last of the frost-killed tomato vines. He pulled the Range Rover onto the shoulder and got out. "Excuse me, sir. Could I have a minute of your time?" Aldous straightened up. He had not slept well. Matilda had wandered into the workshop at 3 in the morning, and he had found her standing in front of the leather tool roll, holding the smallest plane in both hands, weeping without sound. "Mama, what's wrong?" he had whispered. "I forgot, Aldous. I forgot what these were for." He had walked her back to bed and sat in the kitchen until first light, watching the steam rise off a coffee he never drank. And now there was a stranger at his fence. A young man, 28 or 29, wearing a coat that cost more than Aldous made in a month of repairs. "Help you?" "Aldous Brennan, that's right." He did not extend his hand. His own was stained dark with garden soil. Silas seemed to take this as something other than what it was. "My name is Silas Whitmore. I'm with Whitmore Timber and Veneer up off Route 100. I'll get straight to it, Mr. Brennan. We have a situation. We harvest about 200 trees a year from the upper allotment maples and spruce mostly, and a portion of every load comes out with grain irregularities that make it useless for the markets we sell into. Figured wood, wavy. Some of it spiraled so bad you can't run it through a planer without it splitting. Right now we pay to haul it down to Rutland to be burned." Aldous said nothing. He had learned from his father that most men given enough silence will walk themselves all the way to the end of a sentence without any help. "I've been driving around the county looking for someone with property who could use the wood. Free firewood, basically. I noticed you have a long fence line and what looks like a workshop. If you'd be willing to let us drop loads along the fence, you'd save yourself a winter of cutting your own, and we'd save the hauling fee. Everybody wins." He smiled. It was the practiced smile of a man who believed he was performing a kindness. Aldous Brennan looked at him for a long moment. He saw the easy confidence, the assumption that this was a transaction of unequal benefit. The way the young man's eyes had moved across the workshop, without registering the small carved sign above the door that read, "Brennan and Son Esther 1885. He saw for the first time since he was a boy. The precise expression his grandfather Cillian had described one winter evening by the wood stove, the look that came into the eyes of a man who had been taught that wood was only ever wood. But Aldous Brennan was the grandson of a luthier and the son of a luthier, and his ears had heard the words figured maple and spiraled grain and spruce from the upper allotment. And inside his chest, something had started to move that had not moved in 4 months. He saw in the eye of his mind the deep flame pattern that ran through the back of a Guarneri violin, the way light caught the curl of properly quartered Norway spruce on the belly of a Stradivarius. He saw 150 years of slow growth at high altitude. He saw the kind of wood that the great violin makers of Cremona had paid scouts to find in the high forests of the Italian Alps. He saw wood that a luthier in Boston or New York would pay $400 for a single small piece of if he could find it at all. He saw lying in piles along the shoulder of a state road a fortune nobody else could see. How many a year? Roughly 200 trees. Call it 40 cords by volume, give or take. We'd deliver in batches through the fall and winter drop them on the access easement on your side of the fence. You wouldn't need to lift a finger. And it costs you nothing if I take it. It saves us about $27,000 a year in disposal fees, to be honest with you. I'd be the hero of the next board meeting." Aldous looked at the young man one more long moment. He thought of the letter in his coat pocket. He thought of the night shift uniform. He thought of his grandfather Cillian, dead now 31 years, whose hands he had watched curl a strip of spruce no thicker than a postcard, until it sang under a single pluck of the thumb. "I'll take it." Silas Whitmore's face brightened. He had just turned an expense into a zero. He pulled a small leather notebook from his coat pocket and wrote, "Brennan J. Brook Road fence drops," in a careful slanted hand. He held out his hand to shake. Aldous looked at it. His own was still dark with soil. Silas laughed. Right, of course. I'll have the first delivery scheduled for the end of next week." He walked back to the Range Rover. He climbed in. He drove away. He had already forgotten the man's first name. Aldous stood at the fence for a long time after the dust had settled back onto the road. He felt something he had not felt since June. A small, careful warmth in the center of his chest. He could not have named it. But it was the feeling of a man who has just been handed the answer to a question he had not yet learned how to ask. That evening Matilda was having a good supper. These were rare, now growing rarer, and Aldous had learned to treat them the way a fisherman treats a clear afternoon in November, as a gift to be neither questioned nor wasted. They ate beef stew from the slow cooker, with the soda biscuits she had taught him to make when he was 9. She told him a story he had not heard her tell in 20 years. About the winter. His grandfather had carved a small wooden cat for the postmaster's daughter, who had scarlet fever, and how the girl had held that cat in her hand for 3 weeks and lived. When she had finished, he set down his spoon. "Mama, something happened today." He told her about the man at the fence, the wood, the offer. She listened with her head tilted slightly to one side, the way she had listened to him all his life when he was working through a problem out loud. When he was done, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she stood up from the table. "Aldous, come with me. There is something in the shop I should have given you a long time ago." He followed her across the gravel path in the cold blue dusk. The workshop smelled of cedar shavings and old machine oil, and the faint, almost imperceptible sweetness of rosin. She walked to the back wall, knelt down with some difficulty, and pulled aside a folded canvas dropcloth he had assumed for 30 years was covering nothing but stacked offcuts. Behind the canvas was a small chest, black walnut, hand-cut dovetails, a brass clasp gone green with age. He had never seen it before. "Mama, what is that?" "My wedding gift from your father. He told me to keep it hidden until you were ready. He said I would know." She opened the clasp. Inside, folded into a square, was a piece of heavy drafting paper, yellowed at the edges to the color of weak tea. She lifted it out with both hands and laid it on the workbench. It was a drawing, a blueprint done in fine black ink in the careful slanting hand of a man who had been taught to draft in a country that no longer existed. A violin, front view, back view, cross-section. The scroll carved in the shape of a hermit thrush with its head tilted back to sing. Across the top, in a script Aldous recognized from the labels inside, two unfinished instruments that had hung in his grandfather's cabinet his entire life. "To be built by my son, or his son's son, from the figured maple and resonant spruce of the Green Mountains, when our family is patient enough to wait for the wood to come home to us." And below the words in the same hand, Aldous Brennan, 1948. Aldous stared at it. His grandfather had drawn this 54 years ago. His grandfather had dreamed of building this violin from Vermont wood and had spent 23 years walking the back roads of 3 counties looking for trees with the right grain and had never found them. His father, Declan, had tried twice in the 70s and given up. The wood, his father had said, had to come to them. You did not go looking for it. You waited until it found its way to your door. Aldous felt his throat close. He could not get a sound out. Matilda placed her hand on the back of his. Her fingers were cold and very light, the bones beneath the skin like the small bones inside a finished violin neck. Her eyes were clearer than they had been since June. "Aldous, the wood is coming." He stood in his grandfather's workshop, holding a 54-year-old dream in his hands, and he understood. He understood that the young man at the fence that morning had not been doing him a favor. The young man at the fence had been the answer to a question Aldous Brennan had asked of God before Aldous was born. He thought of the letter in his coat pocket. He thought of the flag stamp. He pulled it out, looked at it once more under the single yellow bulb that swung gently on its chain from the workshop ceiling. He looked at his mother. She was watching him. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "You should tear it up, Aldous." He tore it, once, twice, 4 times. He walked to the small cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the workshop, opened the door and dropped the pieces onto a bed of glowing oak coals. They flared, curled, were gone. The first delivery came 9 days later. A flatbed truck with a hydraulic arm pulled up to the fence at 7:30 in the morning and unloaded 31 logs along the easement in 2 neat rows, the cut ends still bleeding sap that had begun to crystallize in the cold. The driver waved at Aldous through the cab window and drove away without a word. Aldous walked out to the fence in his work coat. He stood among the logs for a long time. He laid his palm flat on the cut end of the largest piece, a sugar maple maybe 30 inches across the heartwood, the color of dark honey, the grain spiraling outward from the center in tight, shimmering whorls that caught the morning light like the surface of a wind-blown pond. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 4 months, the wood spoke to him. It said one word: wait. He did. He began that afternoon the slow, deliberate work of dismantling the logs, not with a chainsaw, but with a froe and a hardwood mallet, splitting the wood along its natural grain, the way his grandfather had taught his father, and his father had taught him. He stacked the split billets in the open-sided drying shed Cillian had built in 1923 with cedar spacers between each layer to let the air move freely. The wood would need to rest, to breathe, to slowly, patiently forget the forest. 10 years at minimum. 15 would be better. 20 would make a violin a man could hear weeping from across a concert hall. He worked alone through October, into November, into December. Matilda watched from the kitchen window in the afternoons when she was clear, and in the mornings she sometimes did not know who he was. The neighbors began to talk. By the end of November, the second delivery had come, 52 logs, and the pile along the fence had grown into a small wooden ridge visible from the county road. The third delivery came in January in the middle of a snowstorm, 67 logs. One Saturday afternoon in early February, a man named Ezekiel Crane, who owned the dairy farm a half-mile down Jewel Brook Road, drove past slowly in his pickup truck. He looked at the growing pile of wood through the chain-link fence at the edge of the easement. He shook his head. He drove home and told his wife. Aldous Brennan's lost his mind. He's stockpiling firewood like the Russians are coming. His mother doesn't know what day it is, and he's out there every morning with a froe and a wedge, splitting trash maple and stacking it like he's building an ark. His wife sighed. That poor man. He buried that baby in June. You leave him be. But 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in the third week of February, there was a knock on Aldous Brennan's front door. He opened it to find a man in a state-issued khaki shirt and a clipboard with the kind of mustache that announces before its owner speaks that he has read every line of every municipal code in 3 counties and is about to ruin somebody's afternoon. Behind him, parked on the gravel, was a white pickup truck with the seal of the Windsor County Code Enforcement Office on the door. And behind that truck, just visible at the end of the driveway, was Ezekiel Crane's red Ford idling on the shoulder, with Ezekiel himself watching from the cab. Mr. Brennan, my name is Howard Stanmark. I'm with County Code Enforcement. We've received a formal complaint regarding the unpermitted accumulation of combustible material on your property. I'm going to need to inspect the back lot, and depending on what I find, you may be looking at a hearing before the select board within the month. Aldous Brennan stood in his open doorway with the February cold pouring in around him, and he thought of the 54-year-old drawing folded inside the cedar chest in his workshop, and the 800 billets of figured maple stacked in his grandfather's drying shed, and the small thumb plane in the leather roll on the workbench that had not been picked up by a Brennan hand in over a century without good reason. He thought of Cora. He thought of Finnan. He thought of his mother upstairs, who had asked him that morning if his father was coming home for lunch. And somewhere out beyond the workshop, in the bare birches along the fence line, a hermit thrush that should have flown south 2 months ago opened its throat and sang one slow falling note into the cold winter air, the way the wood his grandfather had once told him always sang at the beginning of something. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of March in the basement meeting room of the Ludlow Town Hall, a long, low room with cinder-block walls painted the color of weak coffee and a row of fluorescent tubes that hummed at a pitch just slightly off from any note a violin could play. Aldous arrived 20 minutes early in the suite he had been married in 11 years earlier and had not put on since the funeral. The jacket was tight across the shoulders now. His hands, washed 3 times that morning, still carried the faint dark stain of walnut oil along the cuticles that no amount of soap had ever lifted. Howard Steinmark sat at a folding table to the right of the dais, his clipboard squared precisely with the edge of the table, his pen laid parallel to the clipboard. Ezekiel Crane sat behind him in the first row of metal folding chairs in a clean flannel shirt and a windbreaker looking at the floor. There were 9 other people in the room. 3 of them Aldous recognized from the post office and the feed store. 6 were strangers. The select board read the file. They asked Howard to present his findings. He stood, cleared his throat, and spoke for 9.5 minutes about code volume and setback requirements and the language of Municipal Code 27B3, which forbade the accumulation of more than 3 cords of combustible material within 60 feet of an occupied structure without a stored fuel permit. He used the phrase fire risk to neighboring properties 4 times. He did not look at Aldous once. When he was finished, the chair of the board, a small gray-haired woman named Eleanor Pike, who taught 5th grade at the Ludlow Elementary School, turned to Aldous and offered him a faint, tired smile. "Mr. Brennan, would you like to respond?" He stood. He had spent the previous 3 nights at his kitchen table trying to write something. He had filled and crumpled 6 pages and burned them one after another in the same wood stove that had taken the security guard application. He had nothing now but the suit and the stained cuticles and a clean white sheet of paper, folded once in his inside pocket, on which he had written the single word "please" and underlined it twice, just so his hand would have something to hold. He opened his mouth. He had no idea what was going to come out of it. And then from the back of the room a voice, dry, slow, almost amused. "Madam Chair, if the board would indulge an old man for 2 minutes, I have something to say that may be relevant." Aldous turned. An elderly man was rising to his feet in the last row, holding the back of the chair in front of him for support. He was very tall, even bent, with a long, lean frame, and white hair brushed straight back from a high forehead, wearing a brown corduroy jacket that had been good in 1972 and was honest now. His name was Ezra Pennington. He was 80 years old. He had retired from the Ludlow post office 14 years earlier, and Aldous had not seen him in town since the funeral. Eleanor Pike nodded. "Mr. Pennington, please." Ezra walked slowly to the front of the room, leaning on a cane Aldous had not noticed in the back. He took his place at the small lectern beside Howard Steinmark, who shifted in his seat and looked for the first time mildly uncertain. "I came here today because my granddaughter works at the town clerk's office. When she read me the agenda over the telephone last night, and I heard the name Brennan, I told her I would walk through a blizzard in my slippers to be in this room this morning." He paused. He looked at Aldous across the row of folding chairs. "In the autumn of 1971, my daughter Imogen was 12 years old. She had been admitted to the preparatory program at the New England Conservatory in Boston on a scholarship that depended on her playing an audition in the second week of November. The Monday before that audition, she dropped her violin down the back staircase of our house. The neck cracked clean through at the heel. 3 luthiers in Rutland and Springfield told me it could not be repaired in less than a month, and that the cost would be more than I made in a season." He turned slightly to face the board. "On the Wednesday of that week, Declan Brennan came to my door. I had not asked him to come. I had not even told him what had happened. He had heard it somewhere, the way news traveled in this town in those days, the way it still does. He spent 2 days at his bench, and on Friday evening, he drove out to my farm and handed me the violin back with the neck so cleanly rejoined that you would have needed a magnifying glass to find the line. He would not let me pay him $1. I tried for an hour. He said, and these are the words he said, 'The Brennan family does not throw away a thing that still has a song inside it.'" Ezra turned back toward Aldous. "My Imogen played her audition the next Saturday. She's 63 years old today, and she has been the principal violist of the Cleveland Orchestra for 31 years. She still plays on that same violin. Declan Brennan never asked me for anything in return. I have been waiting 31 years to find a way to pay that debt." He looked at Eleanor Pike. His voice did not rise. "I do not know what Aldous Brennan is doing with that pile of wood behind his shop. I do not need to know. But I know what the man's grandfather built in this town, and I know what his father did with his hands when nobody was watching. And I am telling this board with all the certainty an old man is allowed in one lifetime that whatever is back there behind that fence is not a hazard. It is a promise being kept, and this county would be poorer for stopping it." He gave a small formal nod, walked back to his seat in the last row, and sat down. The room was very quiet. Howard Steinmark was looking at his clipboard as though he had never seen it before. Eleanor Pike conferred with the 2 other members of the board for less than a minute. Then she leaned forward into the small microphone. "The complaint is dismissed. Mr. Brennan, the town will work with you on a retroactive storage permit at no fee, and the inspector's office will treat the western lot as an active agricultural drying operation under Section 14-9, which exempts it from the setback requirement. We wish you well in your work, whatever it may be. She paused, glanced at Howard, glanced back at Aldous, and added quietly, almost as an afterthought, Mr. Brennan, I taught your wife in the 5th grade. I'm sorry for what these past months have been. Please tell your mother that Ellie Pike sends her love. He could not answer her. He nodded. He sat down. He sat for a long time after the room had emptied. When he stood up, Ezekiel Crane was still in the first row alone, now looking at his boots. Ezekiel stood when Aldous walked past. He did not lift his eyes. Brennan, Ezekiel, I was wrong. I'll write the board a letter. Don't. There's no need. There is a need. I'll bring it by your shop on Saturday. He did. On Saturday morning, a manila envelope appeared on Aldous's porch, with a single folded sheet inside 2 paragraphs in Ezekiel's careful, blocky handwriting, signed and dated. There was no note. Beside the envelope was a small bundle wrapped in waxed brown paper. Aldous opened it on the kitchen table. Inside was 6 dozen of the kind of long iron nails an old farmer keeps in a coffee can in the barn, hand-forged square shank the heads worn smooth from a lifetime of use. The kind of nails his grandfather had used to pin the corner posts of the drying shed in 1923. A note in the same blocky hand. These were my father's. He kept them for something good. I think you might know what. Aldous sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes, holding one of the nails in his palm. He found Ezra Pennington's address in the town directory that evening and drove out the next day with a quart jar of his mother's blueberry preserves from the cellar. The last of the summer, she had still been clear enough to do the canning. Ezra opened the door, looked at the jar, looked at Aldous's face, and said, Come in, son. The kettle is on. I have been waiting for you to figure out where I live. They sat at the old man's kitchen table for 2 hours that afternoon. Ezra did not speak of the hearing. He spoke instead of the winter of 1936, when he had been 14 and his own father had taken him out to the Brennan shop to watch Cillian rehair a bow, and of how Cillian had let him hold the small thumbplane at the end of the visit just for a moment, and had told him in a voice so quiet the boy had to lean in that there were tools in the world that knew more than the men who held them, and that the right thing to do with such a tool was to listen to it. When Aldous stood to leave, Ezra walked him out to the porch. You will need help in the shed before next winter, Aldous. The east post is going. I saw it from the road 2 months ago. I know it. My grandson is 15 and lazy. He needs a job that will teach him something. I will send him to you on Saturday mornings. You will not pay him. I will pay him out of his eyes by telling him that the day he quits is the day he stops being welcome at my table. Aldous tried to refuse. Ezra raised one hand palm out and shook his head once. This is not a favor to you. You will be doing the favor to me. Let an old man pay a debt the way he wants to pay it. The grandson, whose name was Owen, arrived at 7 the following Saturday morning, sullen and underdressed, and worked beside Aldous in the cold for 4 hours without saying 10 words. He came back the next Saturday, and the next. By the middle of April, the east post of the drying shed had been replaced. The canvas tarps over the open sides had been regrommeted and retied, and Owen had begun without being asked to sweep out the workshop at the end of each visit and to coil the extension cords in the way Aldous coiled them palm over palm. He still did not say much, but on the last Saturday in April on his way to the truck, he turned and said, Mr. Brennan, my grandfather says you are building something. Is that true? Aldous said, I am trying to. Owen nodded, climbed into the truck, and was driven away. Other small gifts began to appear. A cord of dry seasoned cherries stacked one morning beside the workshop door with no note. 2 gallons of pure tung oil left on the porch in a brown paper bag from the hardware store with the receipt removed. A box of strings, 4 full sets of Pirastro Gott from Germany, that must have cost the better part of $100 mailed in a padded envelope with no return address. He never learned who sent the strings. He suspected Imogen Pennington, who had heard from her father what had happened in the basement of the town hall and had wired the money to the music box in Boston the same afternoon. He never asked. He simply put the strings in the small cabinet above the bench where his grandfather had kept the same kind of envelope from the same shop in 1958. He began that spring to work again. Not on the violin in the drawing, not yet that wood was still wet from the forest, and would be wet for another 7 winters. He began on a child-sized practice instrument, a quarter-size violin built from older stock his grandfather had laid down in 1969 and never used. He had not built a complete instrument since the year before Finan was born. His hands had forgotten things. The first scroll he carved came out lopsided, and he threw it in the stove. The second cracked along the volute. The third he set aside without finishing because he could not find the line. He sat at the bench late one night in May with 3 failed scrolls in a row on the workbench in front of him and his head in his hands, and he thought, "I have lost it. Whatever they had, I have lost it." He went out to the porch in the dark. The frogs in the marsh at the bottom of the back pasture were singing, and from the bare crown of the largest white birch by the workshop door, a hermit thrush opened its throat and sang one slow falling phrase 3 notes, and a rest the same phrase he had heard from the same tree the morning of the hearing in February. He went back inside, picked up the 4th blank, and carved a scroll that came clean off the wood at midnight. A scroll shaped at the crown like the head of a small bird tilted back to sing. He sat looking at it for a long time. He whispered almost too soft to hear the wood still remembers its song. He finished the quarter-size violin 2 weeks before Owen's 12th birthday. He gave it to Owen on a Saturday morning, wrapped in a clean flour sack, and told the boy it was payment for the work he was no longer allowed to refuse. Owen looked at the violin for a long moment, and then sat down on the workshop floor and cried. He had been taking lessons at the elementary school on a rented instrument for 2 years and had told no one in his family because his father had said music was for girls. Ezra learned of it for the first time that afternoon and called Aldous that evening and could not speak for a full minute on the telephone. That was the spring of 2003. The summer passed. The fall came in copper and gold along Jewel Brook Road, and a second delivery of 48 logs went into the drying shed and the cedar spaces his grandfather had milled in. 1924 separated the new wood from the wood of the previous year. Aldous turned 35. Matilda forgot his name for 2 days and then remembered it again on the 3rd and held his face in both her hands at the breakfast table and said, "Aldous, my Aldous, where have you been?" And he said, "Right here, Mama, I have been right here." She nodded as if she had suspected as much. The years moved the way years move. The pile in the drying shed grew. The shed itself was extended twice with Owen swinging a hammer beside him now, no longer sullen. Aldous built and sold 3 full-size instruments in those years, modest ones, to a music teacher in Rutland, and a folk fiddler in Burlington, and a graduate student at Dartmouth. And the money kept the lights on, and the property tax paid, and bought the small comforts his mother needed at the end. She died in the early hours of a Sunday morning in the spring of 2007 in her own bed, with her son holding her hand, and the window open onto a hillside of new wild trillium, the kind of death an old woman in Vermont is allowed to pray for. Her last clear words were spoken 3 days before, when she opened her eyes in the gray afternoon and looked at Aldous and said, "I figured something out. Waiting is not wasting time. Waiting is loving." And then she had closed her eyes again and gone wherever she had been going. He buried her beside his father in the cemetery on the western slope of Mount Holly. He found among her things in a hat box on the top shelf of her closet a letter she had written to his grandfather, Cillian, in the autumn of 1968, and never mailed. "Dear Otto, it began in her young woman's hand. I am writing this on the morning of my wedding. Declan is downstairs frying eggs and singing badly. And I have never been so grateful for anything in my life as for the fact that you taught him to listen to Wood, because he listens to me the same way, patient without interrupting, hearing the things I do not say. I think you taught him how to love. I will spend my life trying to deserve it. He read it sitting at the kitchen table, and he set it down, and he understood that his mother had known all along the thing he was only now beginning to learn. The winter that followed her death was the worst winter the Green Mountains had recorded in 40 years. The Valentine's Day blizzard of 2007 dropped 4 feet of snow on Windsor County in 72 hours, with sustained winds out of the northwest gusting to 70. Aldous had driven Owen and Ezra to Burlington 2 days earlier to stay with Ezra's daughter, because the old man's furnace had failed and the parts would not come until the following week. He himself stayed. The county had not yet cleared Jewelbrook Road by the second night, and would not for another 4 days. The drying shed had been built in 1923 to hold snow loads of 2.5 feet. By midnight on the second night, Aldous, standing at the kitchen window with a kerosene lamp, could see the roof of the long shed sagging in the middle. The ridgepole bowed visibly under the weight, and he knew with a cold certainty that if the roof went, 800 billets of figured maple representing 23 years of his life and 59 years of his grandfather's dream would go with it. He put on his father's old wool coat and his grandfather's leather mittens, and he went out into the storm with a snow scoop and a coil of climbing rope tied around his waist, with the other end anchored to the door handle of the workshop. Because the wind had taken visibility to less than 10 feet, and a man could lose the path to his own door in that kind of weather, and freeze to death 20 paces from his own wood stove. He climbed the ladder he had leaned against the leeward eave at sundown. He began to shovel. He shoveled for 2 hours. His shoulders went from pain to fire to numbness. The snow came at him sideways. He could not feel his face. He worked in a kind of trance, scoop by scoop, the way his grandfather had told him. A man worked when the work was the only thing standing between him and what he had built. Twice the wind nearly took him off the roof. Once he slid 4 feet down the leeward slope and was stopped only by the rope around his waist, and he hung there for a long moment in the dark, with the snow blowing into his open mouth, and thought of Cora and thought of Finan, and thought of how strange it would be for them to find him in the spring frozen against the rope, and how angry his mother would have been at him for being so careless. He climbed back up. He kept shoveling. It was a little after 2 in the morning when he heard through the howling of the wind a sound that did not belong to the storm. A diesel engine, low and laboring, and the heavy chunking rhythm of a snowplow blade on packed gravel. He stopped, stood up on the slick crown of the roof, and looked toward the road. A pair of yellow headlights was coming up his driveway through the white, slow as a heartbeat. The plow was a town truck, an old one. The man driving it was a man Aldous had not spoken to in 5 years, and had not expected to see on his property ever again in either of their lives, and had in fact sat across from in the basement of the Ludlow Town Hall on a Tuesday morning in March of 2003 and watched accuse him in front of his neighbors of being a hoarder and a danger. The truck stopped 20 feet from the drying shed. The driver's door opened. Ezekiel Crane climbed down, a snow shovel in one hand and a second pair of leather mittens in the other, and looked up through the blowing snow at Aldous Brennan on the roof, and shouted with the wind tearing the words almost away before they could be heard. "Brennan, I saw your light from the county road. You damn fool, get down off that roof. I will take the east side." He was already climbing the ladder before Aldous could answer. They worked together until the gray of first light began to show in the east. 2 men in their middle years on the roof of an old shed in the worst storm in 40 winters. Neither of them speaking after the first exchange, neither of them needing to. The ridgepole held. By dawn the wind had begun to drop, and the snow had eased to flurries, and the long flat roof of the drying shed lay clear and dark against the white of the buried pasture, with 800 billets of figured maple still safe beneath it. They climbed down. They stood beside the truck in the new gray morning. Ezekiel did not look at him. "My father lost his shop in the blizzard of 47. I was 8 years old. I watched him stand at the kitchen window and cry. I have not been a good neighbor to you, Brennan. I will not ask you to forgive me. I only ask that you let me come back tomorrow and help you clear the drifts off the back wall before they melt and rot the sills." Aldous opened his mouth to answer. He never got the chance. The kitchen phone, just audible now that the wind had dropped, began to ring inside the house with the particular long insistent ring of a long-distance call placed in the very early morning. The kind of call a man receives only twice or three times in his life, the kind of call that is never in the history of telephones. The bearer of any news a man would have wished to hear. The voice on the other end of the line was a man Aldous had never spoken to, with the careful, slow cadence of someone trained to deliver bad news to strangers. "Mr. Brennan, my name is Sergeant Thaddeus Morrow with the Coos County Sheriff's Office in Oregon. I am calling about your sister, Maeve Brennan Doyle, and her husband, Rowan Doyle." Aldous sat down on the kitchen chair beside the wall. Outside, Ezekiel Crane stamped snow from his boots on the porch. There was a collision on Highway 101 last night, just south of Bandon. A logging truck lost its brakes coming down a grade. "We need you to come out, Mr. Brennan." They had a daughter. She's 16. She's with us at the station. We have been trying to reach next of kin since 1 in the morning. He drove to Oregon on the third day after the roads cleared 3 days through the long flat middle of the country, sleeping 4 hours a night in motel parking lots, because every bed he tried to lie in felt obscene. He brought Wren back in the passenger seat of his father's old Ford pickup, 16 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's freckles across the bridge of her nose, and a kind of stillness in her that frightened him more than tears would have. She did not speak across 2 state lines. She looked at her hands. She looked at her phone. She looked at the white winter fields rolling past the window with the steady gaze of a person counting something only she could see. He turned off the radio outside Cheyenne and never turned it back on. She said her first words to him on the third evening, somewhere east of Toledo, with the lights of an oncoming truck washing across the cab. "Mom said you were the sad one." "I was, for a long time." "Are you still?" "Some days, not the way I used to be." She nodded, as though she had filed the answer away to examine later. He had to pull over twice in the next hour to compose himself, once at a rest area in the dark, where he sat on the cold concrete of the picnic shelter, with his hands over his face, and once on the shoulder of an empty stretch of highway, where Wren did not look at him and did not look away. When he finally got back behind the wheel, she reached across the gear shift and laid her small cold hand on the back of his. "Mom said you would know what to do. I do not need you to know yet. I just thought I should tell you," she said that. She did not cry for 9 months. She enrolled in the 11th grade at Black River High School. She earned A's in every subject. She helped him with the dishes after supper, and she did not ask for anything she could not explain. She had brought with her in a duffel bag a leather sketchbook her mother had given her on her 15th birthday. And every night after homework, she sat at the kitchen table and drew in it with the door of the bedroom that had been his mother's, now hers, and the bedroom that had been his and Cora's, still closed at the end of the hall. He did not ask to see the sketchbook. He did not ask her about her mother. He did not ask her anything she had not yet decided how to answer. He fed her. He drove her to school. He left clean-folded laundry on the foot of her bed every Sunday evening. He listened. The wood was teaching him this slowly. The wood was teaching him that there were forms of waiting that were not absence at all, but the most attentive form of love a person knew how to give. On a Saturday night in early November of 2008, a hard rain on the iron roof of the workshop woke him at 2:30. He could not get back to sleep. He pulled on his boots over his pajamas and walked across the gravel path in the rain to check that the workshop windows were latched. He pushed open the door, and there in the back corner near the smallest stack of seasoning maple sat Wren. She was wrapped in one of his old wool shirts as a kind of robe over her pajamas, her hair wet from the dash between the house and the shed. She had a small flashlight clamped between her shoulder and her cheek. She had her sketchbook open on her lap, and she was drawing on a thin curl of figured maple shaving she had picked up off the floor with a soft graphite pencil. Following the curl of the grain, she did not see him. The rain was loud. She was drawing her mother's face, the arch of the eyebrow, the faint hollow under the cheekbone, the corner of the mouth where Maeve had carried her one persistent smile. She was not putting Maeve onto the wood. She was finding her inside it the way Cillian had said 50 years ago by the wood stove that a luthier did not impose a violin on the wood, but listened until the violin already in the wood was willing to come out. Aldous Brennan stood in the open doorway with the rain at his back, and he understood that the girl asleep down the hall every night was his grandfather's great-granddaughter, as fully as she was his sister's child. He stepped back into the dark. He closed the door without a sound. He walked back to the house in the rain. In the morning before she was up, he went to the workbench and took down a small wooden box from the high shelf above the bench, a box his grandfather had brought from Donegal in 1919 with the rest of his life. Inside was the smallest set of carving gouges Cillian had ever owned, the apprentice set Cillian had used as a boy of 11. He carried the box into the kitchen and set it on the table beside Wren's place. He folded a piece of brown grocery paper in half and wrote on it in pencil, "For Wren, if you would like to learn." He went out to the workshop. An hour later, the screen door of the house opened and closed. Footsteps came across the gravel, paused. Outside the workshop door came in. She did not say anything. She walked up to the bench and set the box down beside his right hand. She opened the lid, took out the smallest gouge, picked up an offcut of cherry from the bin by the stove, and sat down on the tall stool by the window. She began to carve. She did not stop until lunch. 3 years passed in the rhythm that grief allows. Wren finished high school. She earned a scholarship to a small art college in Providence, where she chose photography for a major and wood carving, as the elective every working photographer at the school told her was a waste of credits. She did not listen. She came home for every long weekend and most of every summer, and she became slowly the second pair of hands the shop had not had since 1971. On a Tuesday morning, in the middle of October of 2011, a deep green Range Rover with Massachusetts plates pulled up to the workshop. Aldous heard the gravel under the tires. He looked up from the bench where he was setting the bass bar of a viola that had been on order from a teacher in Hanover for 2 years. His stomach tightened in a way he had not felt for almost a decade. Silas Whitmore stepped out of the driver's seat. The hair at his temples had gone the color of pewter. He was holding the small hand of a girl who could not have been more than 2.5 in a pink wool coat and red rubber boots and a knit hat with a yarn pom-pom that looked as though it had been knit by a grandmother who loved her very much. The child had her father's gray eyes and a small, serious mouth. Silas walked up to the open workshop door, lifted the little girl over the threshold board, and set her gently on the floor of the shop. He looked for a moment the way men look when they have rehearsed a request for a long drive and are no longer certain they remember the words. "Mr. Brennan, I am sorry to come unannounced. My wife and I had our first child last year. Her name is Beatrix. She turned 2 in August." Aldous wiped his hands on the rag at his belt. He nodded. "Congratulations. I have been hearing for a long time from some of the older men we cut timber for in this part of the county that the Brennan family used to make a small instrument for every child born in Ludlow. I do not know if that is still true. I do not know if it was ever true, but I wanted to ask you. I would pay you whatever you asked. She is a serious child. She listens to music the way other children watch television. I would like her to grow up with a violin made for her, if that is something you would consider." Aldous looked at the man at his door, and then he looked at the child who had wandered 3 steps into the workshop and stopped in front of a half-finished cello hanging on a wall hook, with her small mittened hand held out toward it, but not touching the way a person stands in a church. He thought for one strange long moment about telling Silas Whitmore the truth, about walking him out to the drying shed and showing him the 800 billets of figured maple that had once been the coal pile of his own company. and the 40 more that had come in the last delivery of the previous spring, before Whitmore Timber had sold its cutting rights to a Canadian outfit, and Silas had been let go from the only job he had ever known. He thought about saying the words, the opening of his mouth, the shape of them on his tongue. He thought of his mother. Waiting is loving. He thought of his father 2 days at the bench for a girl he had never met. He thought of Cillian dead now 40 years, and Ezra dead now 4. He thought of the kind of old man he wanted to be when he was finally old. He crouched down so that he was at eye level with Beatrix Whitmore. He smiled at her. She studied him with great seriousness. "I will make her a violin. There will be no charge. It is what my family has always done." Silas began to protest. Aldous lifted one hand and shook his head once, the way Ezra Pennington had shaken his head at him on a porch in the spring of 2003. "It is not for you, Silas. It is for the child." He built it from a single piece of maple he had pulled from the 2003 pile, the very first delivery. 8 years of seasoning, the deepest flame in the lot. He worked on it in the evenings after Wren had gone back to school. On the inside of the back plate, in the small, careful script his grandfather had used inside every Brennan instrument since 1885, he wrote, "For Beatrix Whitmore, built with patience. A. Brennan, 2011. He delivered it to the Whitmore house in Woodstock on the first Sunday of Advent. Silas met him at the door, holding the child on his hip. Aldous opened the case on the front hall table. Beatrix looked at the small violin inside it for a long time. She did not touch it. She turned to her father. "Daddy, it is sleeping." Silas tried 3 times to pay him. Aldous refused gently 3 times. He drove home in the falling dark with the empty case on the passenger seat and the radio off, and he understood that he had laid down a stone in a road whose other end he could not yet see. 7 years passed. By the autumn of 2018, the violin in the drawing had been on his bench for 11 months. He had begun work on it in October of the previous year, on a Friday morning, when the wood, after 16 winters in the drying shed, had finally stopped speaking and gone still in the way Cillian had told him meant ready. He had selected 1 back blank and 2 belly blanks and 1 neck blank from the oldest pile, the 2002 wood from the first delivery, 16 years seasoned, and he had begun. He had not built quickly. He was 50 years old now, and the bones in his right wrist ached when the weather turned, and Wren was beside him on the high stool every weekend with her own work, and there was no hurry left in him for anything. He set the sound post on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. He strung the violin for the first time the following Friday at dusk. He did not play it himself. He had never been able to play more than a child's scale. He set it in its case and closed the lid and went into the kitchen and called the number Wren had written on a card and taped to the wall beside the telephone the week before, the number of a woman named Genevieve Lockhart in Boston. Genevieve Lockhart had appeared at the workshop in early September on a Thursday morning. A tall woman of 50, iron-gray hair cut blunt at the jaw, a black wool coat in the early autumn warmth. She had been driving from Burlington back to Boston on the longer route through the Green Mountains, and she had passed the workshop and seen the small carved sign above the door, Brennan and Son St. 1885, and had pulled over and walked up the gravel drive without knowing why. She had introduced herself as a curator of stringed instruments for a private collection in Beacon Hill. She had asked very politely if she could look at any finished instruments he was willing to show her. He had shown her the viola he had finished the previous spring. She had played 4 bars of a Bach sarabande standing in the middle of the workshop floor with her eyes closed. And when she had opened them again, she had set the viola down with the care of a woman handling a newborn. And she had said very softly, "Mr. Brennan, have you ever heard of a luthier from Donegal named Padraig O'Halloran?" He had not. She had pulled from her purse a small leather case, and from the case a violin label, brown with age, dated 1924, signed in fine slanting script. She had laid it on the bench beside the viola. "My great-grandfather. He apprenticed in a village in County Donegal between 1909 and 1915 to a master maker who took only 1 student in his lifetime. He came to Boston in 1919. He told my grandmother that the master who had taught him was the finest man he had ever known, and that the two of them had agreed before he left Donegal to write to one another every Christmas for the rest of their lives. They wrote for 2 years. Then my great-grandfather's letters began to come back unopened, and he learned through a cousin that the master had emigrated himself somewhere into the north of the United States and could not be traced. My great-grandfather spent the last 30 years of his life trying to find him. He died in 1957 not knowing. Aldous had reached above the bench and lifted down from its place on the high shelf the leather tool roll. He had unrolled it on the bench. He had taken out the smallest plane the thumb plane Cillian had carried across the ocean in 1919 and turned it over and shown her the small initials burned into the heel POH 1908, a parting gift to a master from the only student he had ever taught. Genevieve Lockhart had sat down very slowly on the high stool by the window. She had not spoken for a long time. She came to the workshop that Friday evening in late October of 2018, after the violin from the drawing was strung. She brought with her a colleague, an old man named Hawthorne, who had been the concertmaster of the Boston Symphony for 22 years and now selected instruments for the orchestra's apprentice program. Hawthorne took the violin from its case under the single yellow workshop bulb. He tuned it. He played standing in the middle of the floor, the slow opening of the Méditation from Thais. The room filled with a sound that Aldous had heard once before in his life, and only once on a winter night in 1980, when he had been 12 years old, and his grandfather 6 months before his death had taken down from the locked cabinet the one violin he had finished in his own life and played for a single minute in the workshop with the door closed. When Hawthorne stopped playing, no one spoke for a long time. Outside on the gravel, the sound of tires. A car had pulled into the drive slowly and stopped. Aldous walked to the doorway. A small silver station wagon. Silas Whitmore was climbing out of the driver's seat. From the back, in a wool coat and red rubber boots and a knit hat she had now nearly outgrown, Beatrix Whitmore stepped down onto the gravel, holding the small violin case Aldous had built her 7 years before. She was 9 years old. She had heard the sound of the Méditation through the open kitchen window of a house her father had pulled over to look at 200 yards down the road. She had told her father she needed to stop. She walked up the gravel path with the violin case held against her chest. She came into the workshop and stopped just inside the door and looked at Hawthorne Vale and at the violin in his hands and at the man at the workbench whose face she did not remember from her second birthday. She looked up at her father, who had come in behind her and was standing with one hand against the doorframe, as though without it he might not be able to stand. She looked at Aldous, and she asked the question of a serious child with no edge in it. The question that ends one story and begins another. "Mister, how did you know I would like the small one? You made it before I was even born." Aldous Brennan crouched down in his workshop for the second time in his life, so that he was at eye level with Beatrix Whitmore, who was no longer 2.5 years old. "Because, sweetheart, I had been waiting for a little girl just like you for a very long time." Silas Whitmore began to cry. He did not make a sound. He stood in the doorway of a workshop he had walked past 100 times in 17 years. And the tears moved down his face the way water moves down old wood. And he understood in one long, bright, unbearable moment what he had been given a chance to be part of, and what he had spent the first half of his life failing to see. He could not say, "I am sorry." The words were not the right size. He said instead, the only words he was able to make, "Mr. Brennan, thank you, thank you." Aldous stood. He walked across the floor and held out his hand. Silas took it. They stood holding the handshake the man who had given, and the man who had taken, with a small girl between them holding a violin she had been promised before she was born. Hawthorne wrote a check that night for the violin from the drawing. $185,000. Aldous would not let him hand it over in front of the child. "Mail it," he said. "Send it later. Tonight is not for that." Hawthorne nodded and put the check away, and asked before he left if he could play one more thing. And he played the slow second movement of a Beethoven sonata for the four of them. And Beatrix Whitmore sat on the workshop floor with her own small violin in her lap and listened with both hands flat against the wood. The check arrived 3 weeks later on a Tuesday in mid-November, slid beneath the rolling door at 11:47 at night by a courier who could not find anyone home. The man it was for was in a cemetery on the western slope of Mount Holly, kneeling between two graves he had been visiting more often now that he had finally learned what to say. He found the envelope the next morning in the grey light with snow on his shoulders. He picked it up. He did not open it for an hour. He set it on the workbench beside the leather tool roll, and he stood looking at the small thumbplane with the initials POH burned into its heel. And he thought of Cillian and Padraig writing to each other across an ocean for 2 years, and of how the silence between them had not been the end of the friendship, but only the part of it neither of them had been alive to see completed. He opened the envelope. He read the check. He set it down. He walked to the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee and brought it back to the bench and drank it slowly. And outside the workshop window in the bare crown of the white birch by the door, a hermit thrush that should have flown south 2 months ago opened its throat and sang one slow falling phrase, 3 notes and a rest. The way the wood had told him long ago that it always sang at the end of something, and at the beginning of something else. He picked up the small plane. He laid his hand on a billet of figured maple from the 2007 pile, 11 years, seasoned now ready in another 4. He whispered almost too soft to hear the words his grandfather had spoken to him in a workshop on a winter night. In 1980, the words his mother had told him meant the same thing as love. The wood still remembers its song. So tell me, friend, as the fire burns low and the snow keeps falling outside your window, what is the thing in your own life that someone once called worthless? And what might it become if you were willing to wait for it the way it has been waiting for you? Leave a word in the comments. Stay close. Sleep gently. We will be here next week with another story when the lamp is lit again.